Thanks very much, Stuart. First of all, I think it's a superb backdrop in respect of the whole of the canvas that one has to try and get one's head around when dealing with issues of global governance. And I liked particularly your reference to the core point, I think, that the reason that we're concerned about global governance is because we're confronted with a range of risks and vulnerabilities which are incapable of being addressed adequately at the national level. We don't have a paradigm, I think, that is structured today that enables us to develop a core concept of what global governance is. It's a remarkably amorphous concept. It tends to exist in the mind of the speaker or the mind of the listener in the course of every debate around this issue, whether this debate is taking place in a graduate seminar, whether it's taking place in the Security Council, whether it's taking place at the COP17 in Durban, or anywhere else, including this room here this afternoon. So the real challenge, it seems to me, is to say that the only reason that we need governance at all is to enable humans to live in comparative harmony with one another in society. That's why we need governance. If we were self-organizing, non-linear adaptive systems, then we wouldn't need any forms of governance at all. The system would work extremely well without any external constraints. But unfortunately, that isn't how things work. The reality of human existence, and it's probably simply due to our biological origins, is that we are competitive, because that's historically how our gene pools were in fact established effectively and enable the survival of the species. We collaborate frequently, usually on the basis of some form of interest or affiliation. So we collaborate more easily with our families than we do with people who are not part of our families, and people who are part of our immediate communities more easily than we collaborate with people outside of our immediate communities. And sometimes we conflict. And the whole purpose of governance at the end of the day, the whole purpose of political systems, is simply to, in fact, put in place normative reference points that enable humans individually and societies or communities collectively to coexist in ways that minimize the risk of conflict, optimize the degree of collaboration or cooperation, and contain competition in a constructive space that doesn't spill over into conflict. Now, implicit in everything that I've said is the fact that that's much easier at the micro-community level. It's much easier on the level where everyone understands what everyone else's motivations are, what everyone else's interests are, what rules the others are going to play. If I can anticipate what everyone around me is likely to do, I can play chess. It's relatively easy. If I can't anticipate that, then of course I am taking risks on a much larger scale in respect of everything that I do. And of course, that is what business is all about at the end of the day. It's in fact seizing asymmetric opportunity in the context of uncertainty. So this balance between cooperation and competition while seeking to contain it at sub-conflictual levels, I think, is the essence of what we try to do at all levels of governance. I agree completely with Stuart's definition of what global governance is all about. It's fundamentally about transcending the national boundary, which is the paradigm that we still have for democratic governance. It's transcending the national boundary where that is necessary in order to grapple with risks or threats which are larger and essentially outside of the control, exogenous to the span of control of the nation state in respect of the nature of the particular issue. And the list of these, Stuart's given a very good list already, but the list is as long as your arm. Broadly speaking, it seems to me that global governance should not seek to intrude into spaces where that prerequisite does not exist. You're not trying to have global governance to displace community governance or national governance. You are trying to add it on in order to be able to address challenge on a scale that cannot be addressed at levels that are easier to manage. Now, why are we? Well, let's throw in one other observation first. What we've done is not very smart. The Swedish Academy of Sciences, in response to a request last year, began a study which was completed, I'm told, in March this year. And the purpose of the study was to identify the range of international instruments that organized international behavior in different ways. So they're treaties, agreements, and other structures, but all of them are multilateral. We're not talking about bilateral agreements now. They came up with a number in excess of 158,000. 90% of these had been concluded since 1945. Now, the mere fact that none of us know what is in these 158,000 agreements that we're all notionally in some or other fashion bound by is in itself, I think, an illustration of the dysfunctionality of the approaches that we're taking in respect of this. And that, I think, causes one to try to get back to first principles in terms of trying to understand why we need certain forms of global governance today and what the nature of those might be, because that's the only way that we can, to take your 3 points, take stock of the current state, think about how rising and emerging powers are likely to act, and what forms of leadership we might then see emerging from the system. So let's think a little bit about what's happened in the world in the course of the past, I suppose, 20 years, really. What's happened in the world in the course of the past 20 years is what we normally capture under the rubric of globalization. And globalization has had a remarkable series of completely divergent consequences which have essentially put the established paradigm that has existed in various forms since the Peace of Westphalia, but preeminently has been entrenched as a global paradigm since roughly the middle of the 19th century, when empires had begun to fragment on a significant scale. Everyone's talked about 1848 many times in the course of this conference. And in the period from roughly 1848 onwards until the the decolonization movement and the immediate aftermath of 1945, we saw the creation of what we now think of as national states. They're not nation states in the true sense of the word. No one in his right mind would suggest that Switzerland or Belgium, for example, were nation states, never mind many states on the African continent. But nonetheless, they are national states in the sense that they qualify for membership of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. Once we entered the 1990s, the wall came down in Germany, the Soviet Union imploded, and Frank Fukuyama decided to declare the end of history in an Hegelian sense. I'm not trivializing the observation. But once that occurred, the operational Western paradigm, which was adopted by an awful lot of other people, became the notion that liberal markets and liberal democracy were in fact the defining elements of the rest of history. Under those circumstances, the spread of liberal democracy and the expansion of free markets became a paradigm which was widely accepted. There was a certain amount of pushback coming out of Southeast Asia in particular until roughly 1997, and in the course of 1997 and 1998, with the Asian crisis followed by the emerging markets crisis, in a certain sense, the alternative models seemed to slip away from the center of discussion about how political and economic existence should be ordered. From that point onwards, broadly speaking, until the crash that began with the collapse of the subprime market in 2007 and culminated, perhaps, we're waiting, I suppose, for the other shoe to fall at the moment, but culminated in the collapse of Lehman Brothers towards the end of 2008, the underlying paradigm was globalization. It was eliminating any constraints on scale. It was seeking to be able to operate on the freest possible basis across the largest possible geographies with the greatest amount of scale that was plausible. And nobody in business schools, and relatively few people in national parliaments or in schools of international studies, would have argued significantly against that proposition over that period. Plenty of qualifiers, but not too much significant opposition to the proposition. So, what did we do in the consequence? What we did in the consequence, firstly, is we lifted roughly 1.5 to 2 billion people out of poverty. And what began in 1979 in China and what happened about, I suppose, 18 years later in India in terms of government getting out of the way of the private sector, unleashed on a global scale in the developing world a scale of new opportunity and new economic advancement, I think unprecedented certainly in modern history, probably in history at large. But in the process, we created levels of complexity and levels of connectivity in respect of economic systems, social systems, political systems that completely transcend our ability to be able to comprehend them and hence to be able to model or manage them. So we have engendered levels of complexity in respect of the world at large that human minds have absolutely no ability to comprehend. Now, I'm going to take something. I've got Thierry Maleret, another Thierry, sitting next to me. A couple of years ago, we did a book on risk in respect of these things, and these particular just illustrative stats actually come out of that particular book. But what I think one has to understand when you start connecting a lot of things up in significant ways is that an arithmetic increase in the number of elements in a system produces a geometric increase in the number of links and an exponential increase in the number of patterns that emerge. And just to scare you a little bit, 10 elements give you 45 links, but they give you 35.184 billion potential patterns. Now, the terribly disappointing thing about this, and I'm doing this rhetorically deliberately, the terribly disappointing thing about this is that your working memory is 7 plus or minus 2 alphanumeric digits. Nobody in this room, nobody in the world has ever been measured who's capable of recalling, in terms of their short-term memory, more than 9 random combinations of numbers and letters. Your ability to process relational variables, things in relationship to one another, is almost certainly limited to 3. There is a tiny percentage of people, including a number of chess grandmasters, who have actually played up to 4 variations outside of a gambit. So when we create enormous levels of complexity, we condemn ourselves to an inability to be able to understand them or manage them. That's the underlying truth of the challenge that we confront at this particular point in time. So the question now becomes, while we've created this extraordinary level of complexity, we have created a whole series of vulnerabilities which are now endemic in the environments that we have to manage.